I really appreciate the invitation. So today I'm going to talk about a study on effective polarization and how beliefs might matter. And so this is joint work with my PhD student, Xingyi Wang. And so it's the first time we actually present this project. So I really appreciate any kind of feedback and helps us improve the paper. All right, so let me start. So it is a well-known empirical fact that in the US, people see each other more negatively. So they think more hostile against members of the opposing party and more positively about their own party. And this is not just the US, but I think the US the trend is particularly pronounced. In the literature, this has been labeled as effective polarization. Now, researchers have been preoccupied with this trend because they were considering the potential consequences on society. So, for example, there are studies that show the social consequences, such as in hiring decisions. For example, the study by Gift and Gift, they show that if you signal in your CV that you're a supporter of the opposing party, then you're less likely to receive a job interview. And the study by McConnell shows that people are actually willing to accept a lower wage to work for a company that is aligned politically. But it's not just in the economic environment that effective polarization could play a role, but also in our romantic relationships. So, for example, there are studies that show that on dating platforms, when people realize that they support the same political party, they're more likely to match. And people have also been hesitant to allow their children to marry across partisan lines. The perhaps most famous study in this domain is the study by Chen and Rolla that was published in Science and showed that for the Thanksgiving dinner, which is I think the biggest holiday in the US, when you have family members who disagree politically, they also tend to have shorter Thanksgiving dinners. Now, political scientists, they don't just worry about social and economic consequences, but they have been also interested in the role of effective polarization from the political perspective. So, for example, there are studies suggesting that people don't tend to vote for a particular party because of their policy proposal, but rather that they're voting against the opposing political party. Other studies have shown that people support democratic norms, but only when their own party is in power. Otherwise, they're against it. And finally, there are also studies showing that effective polarization is associated with increased support for political violence, as well as support for candidates, even though they might engage in undemocratic actions. So this, to summarize this, effective polarization might not just be about how we feel about each other, but it could have real downstream consequences that shape society. Now, unlike ideological polarization, which is the idea that people have policy preferences and then choose their party that they want to support based on their policy preferences, effective polarization is rooted in partisan identity. So it's the other way around. You have first, people want to belong to a party, and then this determines what kind of policies that they support. And so to better understand affective polarization, the literature has turned to social identity theory. This is a well-established theory, and I guess most of you are familiar with it. And the idea is that people derive utility from belonging to a particular social group, and in particular, they want to feel positive about this, so they think of their own group as superior than the outgroup. Now, at least in economics, people have tried to develop models of social identity theory and apply this in the political context. And so the earlier studies have modeled social identity as a preference. So in other words, the idea is that you gain utility if you support your in-group, you gain disutility if you support the outgroup. So here, the modeling approach is that partisan identity is an expression of a taste or preference. But more recent modeling approaches have taken a different path and considered that potentially partisan identity might affect people's beliefs. So, for example, it could be that partisan identity affects how you think about others in terms of their characteristics and traits, but also how you think about policies more generally. Now, if we zoom into these belief-based modeling approaches of social identity theory, which kind of say that people have distorted or biased beliefs, either about other people or about policies, there could be three channels that lead to such inaccurate beliefs. The first one is simply information deficit channel. So maybe, for example, you just don't interact a lot with members of the outgroup of the opposing political party, and so you don't know them well, and as a result, you have a biased view about them. A second channel is heuristic. So it could be that people have cognitive biases or apply heuristic in their belief formation, and that this leads to distorted belief. So for example, there's a paper by Bordalo et al. Published in the QJE in 2016, and they show that the representativeness heuristic could lead to such distorted views. So the idea is that, imagine if I'm being a Democrat, and now I think about the Republicans, what comes to mind is maybe the MAGA people, and the MAGA people might be perceived as being less intelligent, maybe less honest or less trustworthy than others. And so I project that into my perspective about the Republicans more broadly. A third possible channel is that people are kind of immune against truthful or accurate information because they want to protect their social identity, right? So basically, they have a certain beliefs about the outgroup. Now, if they read or receive information that contradicts their initial view, they are hesitant to update their views because it would threaten their social identity. Okay. Now, if the belief channel is correct, or at least partly explains affective polarization, then this has consequences in terms of whether we could in principle address it. So the different channels predict different susceptibility to new information. So if you think about it, if it's just information deficit, then providing accurate information, getting people to talk to each other might or should lead to substantial belief updating because they simply don't know. Now, if it's the heuristic approach, that explains the biased perceptions or views of others, then providing information might partly correct the beliefs, but not fully so, right? So for example, if you think about the previous case that I mentioned about MAGA people, if I receive information that Republicans may be better humans than I initially thought, I might still update a little bit, but I will still think about the MAGA person when forming my beliefs about the Republicans more general. Now, if it's the third channel, the identity protective cognition mechanism, then they're going to be most reluctant to update their beliefs because it directly threatens their social identity and so the utility that they receive from believing in their group. So which channel actually matters for belief formation has both implications for theory and policy. If we think about theory, well, it helps us better understand which belief-based model more accurately describes how people reason, but it also tells us maybe something about the welfare effects of holding inaccurate beliefs. So for example, if the source is just information deficits, then it is beneficial for individuals to receive information and update their beliefs towards the truth because that gives them more utility. On the other hand, if it's an identity protective mechanism, then updating their beliefs might actually be harmful or reduce their utility. And for a more pragmatic perspective, in terms of policy, if we think that affective polarization has these negative consequences in our social lives, but also how people think about political issues, then it matters because different channels predict different susceptibilities to information and thus to the potential of reducing affective polarization. So what stereotypes do we consider here? Because our study is about how people think about voters of the opposing party. So here I draw from research, well-established research in psychology about social perception that says that there are two key dimensions that people use to assess others when they meet new people. So the work by Fiske suggests, and this is has been documented across the globe, is that when we think about others that we don't know well yet, then we categorize them in terms of warmth and competence. So the idea here is that if I approach a new person, I first assess, does this person have good intentions? And then secondly, is the person able to act upon those intentions? And so this lines up with also work on affective polarization that suggests this Manichaean pattern, this good versus evil pattern, showing that counterpartisans attribute more negative traits, such as being selfish, being hypocritical, being less intelligent, and fewer positive traits like being honest, being trustworthy, and open-minded. And so these perspectives about the characteristics or traits of the opposing group, this has intensified and largely tracks also what we observe in terms of affective polarization. So in our study, we're gonna focus on these two key dimensions, warmth and competence, and we conceptualize them as trustworthiness and intelligence. So in this paper, we want to explore more this belief-based approach of social identity theory applied to affective polarization. And so the first question is simply, do partisans, do voters have distorted beliefs about supporters of the opposing political party in these two dimensions, warmth and competence? And then we will test whether providing accurate information about those traits changes not only how they feel about each other, but also whether it has behavioral consequences. And so we measure behavior here as the willingness to interact with counterpartisans in contrast to co-partisans. So here is a general overview of our experiment. We actually conducted two experiments, the trustworthiness experiment and the intelligence experiment, because a priori we weren't sure whether to expect different effects depending on which dimension we will focus on. And we wanted to keep the experiment relatively clean and just focus on one particular domain. So we ran this online experiment on Prolific in July 2024, recruiting 1,600 participants, half identified as Democrats, half as Republicans. And so when they signed up for the study, they were randomly assigned to either the trustworthiness or the intelligence experiment. And then they went basically through the same procedure. So first, we would measure their characteristics, so either trustworthiness or intelligence. Then we measured their beliefs about the in-group and out-group in this dimension. And then they were randomly assigned to an information provision treatment or not. Then we remeasured their beliefs, and then we measured the downstream behaviors. Okay, so the first step was to measure their trustworthiness or intelligence, and we did this with a trust game and the cognitive reflection test. And so the reason why we had this portion at the beginning is so that the participants could experience themselves how we assess those traits. So we didn't want them just tell them how intelligent or how trustworthy other people are, but we wanted to show them exactly how we measured this so that they could get a better sense for it. Now, in addition to giving them the direct experience, we also needed that as a benchmark for incentivizing the beliefs later on in the experiment. So here's the trust game details that we used for our study. For those not familiar with the trust game, it's a two-player game. So you have a player A and a player B. The player A first has to decide whether to trust or not. So here this is labeled as send or keep. So if they don't trust, they choose keep, and then both end up with the same amount here, 25 cents. And if they decided to trust, they would send the money to the other player, player B. As experimenter, we would triple that amount. So there is an incentive to cooperate here or trust. And then player B has the final say, and they can decide how much to return. So the decisions by player B can be considered as a measure of trustworthiness, because the more money that they return to player A, the more trustworthy they are. Now, for those who were assigned to the intelligence experiment, they were presented a cognitive reflection test. We used the expanded test. So the original test has only 3 questions, and the expanded test has 7 questions. And these 7 questions are intended to measure the ability to override impulses or intuitive thinking, and then to analytically solve simple math problems. Now, to prevent that, people might have been familiar with the test. So we changed the numbers, and also to prevent cheating, we set a time limit to 5 minutes. So I mean, there is a possibility that participants would use AI or look up the results. But we try to minimize this, and we also looking at the data, we have no indication that this was the case. Performance in this test was incentivized, just like we used real money in the trust game here as well. We just told them, if you're among the best performance, then you get a bonus of $3. Now, this is certainly not the best test to measure intelligence, and I don't want to really get into a discussion about how to measure intelligence, which is an extremely difficult task. This test is highly correlated with more comprehensive measures, such like the well-known Raven's progressive matrices task, as well as a similar test like the Wechsler abbreviated scale of intelligence, which asks participants to, for example, to explain similarities between similar words. This is perhaps, like I said, not the best test of intelligence, but it serves our purposes. The only thing that we needed here is that people reasonably think that this measures some form of intelligence. So we just take the number of correct answers as our measure of intelligence. And at the bottom of the slide, you see an example of a question. Jerry received both the 13 highest and the 13 lowest mark in the class. How many students are in the class? And so the immediate intuitive response might be 26, right? Because you see the 13 and 13. But if you take a moment to carefully think about it, then you realize that the correct answer should be 25. So to measure the prior beliefs, so the initial beliefs, before we ran the main study, we actually conducted another study where we would recruit participants from the same platform, again, half Republicans and half Democrats, and ask them to complete both the trust game and the intelligence test so that we could use their performances to incentivize the belief elicitation. So the main study participants, they were asked to guess the average trustworthiness, or if they were in the other experiment, the average intelligence of the Democrats and Republicans in that reference group. And again, they were incentivized for accuracy. So the 5 top performers here, like the 5 most accurate participants, received a bonus of $3. And so as our outcome measure, we use the belief gap, so the differences in guesses between how much I think, how trustworthy I think my in-group is compared to my out-group. Now, after measuring the prior beliefs, participants were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions, either the treatment or control group. In the control group, they would just move on. There was no information provided. But in the treatment group, we will provide accurate information about this reference group. As you can see on the screen, that's what they would see. So either they would see the top or the bottom. So the top is about trustworthiness. They would see the average amount returned by player B if the participants were Democrats on the left or Republicans, and they were also reminded of their guesses. Now, as you can see on the slide, these are already the actual results of our initial experiment. And what we can see is that both groups perform very similarly. So we see that Democrats are basically as trustworthy as Republicans, slightly more, but this difference is very minor. And then Republicans slightly score better on the intelligence test than the Democrats. But again, the differences are relatively small. So the information that they will get, and this is truthful information, is that basically there is no partisan gap in trustworthiness or intelligence. Now, after the intervention, we measured again the beliefs, and ideally we would have measured the exact same beliefs to compare them to each other. But this brings some challenges because of potential demand effects and consistency bias. Okay, so if I just received information and being asked again the exact same thing, I might try to guess what the experimenter wants me to say, and might then report beliefs that align with that hypothesis, even though I could earn some money for being accurate. So that could be one factor that could bias the measurement. And the other bias that could occur is that people have generally a desire for consistency, right? They want to be seen as consistent. And so there is this pressure, could be internal or external, to say the same thing as they just said 5 minutes ago. So in order to address this issue, we slightly change what we ask them about for the posterior beliefs. So instead of asking them about the average in the previous experiment, we ask them to think about two randomly selected individuals from the same study that they were in. So why is this, can be this considered still the same, even though we didn't ask them exactly the same? Well, the people that they were thinking about came from the same population, so they were both participants on Prolific. And you think about how to make guesses here. Well, essentially, you have to think about the population expectation. So whether you think about the average or randomly select a person from a sample, you should basically provide the same answer. However, the framing is different. So this was our hope that these potential biases will be minimized. Now, just like with the prior beliefs, we just take the differences in their predictions between how they think about co-partisans versus counter-partisans. Now, after measuring the posterior beliefs, we elicited affective polarization. And we elicited these feelings in two ways. Our primary outcome here is the feeling thermometer, which is the primary vehicle in political science to measure affective polarization. So how this works is that people are simply asked how they feel towards Democrat and Republican voters on a scale from 0 to 100, with 0 being I feel cold about those voters, and 100 meaning I feel very warm about this. Now, just like with the beliefs, we then just take the difference between these two ratings as the measure here of affective polarization. Now, we didn't just want to rely on a single measure of affective polarization, so we also elicit them through the so-called social distance items. This is an alternative approach that has been also frequently used in the literature, and it basically asks participants their willingness to interact with counter-partisans in terms of personal social relationships. So participants are asked how upset they will be if their child will marry someone from the opposing political party, and then also how comfortable they will feel with friends or neighbors from the opposing political party. So each item is then rated on a 0 to 3 scale, and then we take the index, so we take the average answer to these 3 questions. So this is a slightly different way to measure affective polarization. It's more about relationships and more about behavior. But it has been used in the literature partly also because it seems to be more predictive of what political scientists care about, which is political attitudes. So after measuring affective polarization, we then administered a behavioral measure. So here, the willingness to chat. So we asked them to decide, to engage in a 10-minute real-time online chat with either another participant who shared a political identity or a participant who supported the opposing political party. And we also mentioned that the chat should be about a particular topic, and so our primary focus was here, political discussions. Now, why politics? Well, politics is kind of the hardest test of the mechanism, because when people think about politics, it naturally activates their partisan identity and potentially everything that comes with it. And so the question is, if we are able to change people's beliefs, do they revert back to their original beliefs, or do they maintain their beliefs and then maybe behave or make different decisions here? Now, from a normative perspective, political discussions are important because there is research showing that when you can get people together to have political conversation, well, this is generally a good thing for democratic norms, and it helps people also better understand the other side. And this can actually even lead to a virtuous cycle, because if you think about it, having political conversation, if that makes people like each other more across the partisan line, and as research shows that having political discussions can make people feel better about each other, that could in turn again increase the willingness to talk to each other in the future. So this creates a positive self-reinforcing loop. Now, we didn't just ask them about their willingness to chat about politics, but we also chose two different topics: personal finance and pop culture. So the reason for having also these other topics was, on the one hand, there's research suggesting that you actually don't necessarily have to talk about politics, but you could also just talk about anything, and that might reduce effective polarization. And we also wanted just to generally learn more about whether the effects are specific to politics, or whether we can also find them in these other domains that may require the same with different levels of intelligence and trustworthiness. So we actually asked them, and also we piloted how people think about these topics in terms of what they would like to, what they demand in terms of characteristics of their conversation partner. So we asked them how important it is, how trustworthy your chat partner is, and how intelligent your partner needs to be to have a good conversation about these three topics. And as you can see here on the slide, people demand more trustworthiness and more intelligence when they talk about politics and personal finance, and less so about pop culture. I just realized that I think the labels are wrong here. So
Yeah.
personal finance and politics are basically identical in terms of these demanded characteristics. Pop culture is very different. So are there questions?
No, I was wondering exactly when you said the scale was, the symbols were reversed. Yes.
Yes, sorry, the symbols were reserved. Yeah, reversed. Absolutely. So yeah, you can imagine that talking about Taylor Swift, like I don't need a very trustworthy or necessarily super smart person, but if I talk about personal finance strategies, then yes, I want someone competent to chat with. And if I reveal personal information about my finances, also I want an honest and trustworthy person to chat with. Okay, and then we basically measured the willingness to chat using the famous Becker de Groot Marshak procedure, which is an incentive compatible way to measure the willingness to accept or willingness to pay for things. So we asked them, how much do we need to pay you to have this 10-minute conversation? And then we asked this question for all three topics in a randomized order, as well as the two types of potential partners, either a Democrat or Republican person from the same study. And then just like the other measures, we take the difference between when they answer the question about the co-partisan versus the counter-partisan. So we take the difference in the willingness to accept about having a chat with the co-partisan versus counter-partisan. So if I don't want to talk to an outgroup member, right, then I should require a higher amount to talk to that person. And as a consequence, the difference in the willingness to accept should be positive. If, on the other hand, for whatever reason, maybe I'm just curious to talk to an outgroup member, then this difference will be negative. So how was this then implemented? So we explained to them that we would then draw a random number between 0 and 10. You see here the probabilities for each possible payoff that or offer that we would make. Now, subjects didn't know this, and this is common for VDM experiments and doesn't really affect the results. We didn't want to burden them too much with the details, but we were truthful, so we basically drew a random offer between 0 and 100, and that depending on whether the offer was larger than they said what the minimum payment would need to be in order to have the chat, then they would have the chat and would receive the payment. Otherwise, if we would provide them with a lower offer than what they asked us, then they would have no chat and no additional payment. So we choose these parameters here because we're actually not really interested in the outcomes of these conversations. So some people had these chats, but it was not everybody. Okay, so let me now turn to the results. First, how accurate are participants about the in-group and the out-group in terms of these two traits? So you see here on the left the results for the trustworthiness experiment, and on the right the same for the intelligence experiment. The red dashed line signals that what the truth is. And as you can see here, they were remarkably accurate about the in-group. I was actually really surprised to see that on average, they're spot on both in terms of trustworthiness and intelligence. At the same time, we also see that they think lesser of the out-group. So both they think that the counter-partisans are less trustworthy than reality and that they are less intelligent than the truth. So now the question is, if we provide them with accurate information, does that lead to them to change their beliefs? And remember that at the beginning, I said there are three possible channels or mechanisms how belief can be distorted. Some are more conducive to belief updating, like if it's just like a lack of knowledge interaction with the outgroup, then we should expect substantial updating. At the other extreme, if they want to protect their partisan identity, they don't want to maybe learn that the outgroup is kinder and smarter than they thought they would be, so then we should expect little to no updating. So here are the results in terms of beliefs. So on the left, first you see the prior gap between how they think about the outgroup compared to the in-group. And so a positive number means that I think the in-group is better along in this particular dimensions. On the left, it's about trustworthiness, right? Is intelligence. So they think both the treatment and control group are the same before the information provision. After giving information that is accurate to the treatment group, we see a considerable reduction in this gap between how I think about the out group and the in group. And this is basically identical across the two experiments, right? The gap reduces by roughly 2/3 in both cases. At the same time, we don't completely eliminate this belief gap. So there remains some portion of the belief gap, meaning that I still think my in-group's a little bit smarter and kinder than the out-group. So now let's focus on the potential downstream consequences, both on affective polarization as well as on behavior. So just like other studies, when we look at the control group, we find that they're significantly polarized. Remember that the feeling thermometer measures those feelings on a scale from 0 to 100. And so what we find is that in the control group, they think of their in-group 32 points warmer than the out-group. This is comparable to what literature has shown, but it still always kind of like shocks me to see these big differences. Now, we also find a correlation between these belief gaps, so how people think about others in terms of trustworthiness and intelligence, and how they feel about each other. So here we use the posteriors because that came just before our measure of affective polarization, but the results are basically the same if we would take the priors. So there is this connection between how people think about others and how they feel about others. Now, given that we change their beliefs, do we also see a change in affective polarization? And the answer is no. So on the left, you see the results when we pool both experiments. And then we also show this for each individual experiment. And as you can see, there is no clear pattern that emerges. And it's not just the feelings thermometer that shows this result, but we get essentially analogous results if we use the social distance item as our measure of affective polarization. So our information treatment led to substantial belief updating, but we don't see any changes here in how people feel about the in-group versus the out-group. So then the next question then is, okay, we don't see any change in affective polarization, but maybe we see a change in the willingness to chat with the out-group. So here are the results first, just for the control group, in terms of how much money they require to talk to the out group compared to the in group. So a positive number here means that you need to pay me more to have this conversation. Again, here I show the results both for the pooled sample as well as the individual experiment. And we see that they demand a premium to pay with the out-group member of 70% for politics. We find relatively similar effects for the non-political topics, 16% more in terms of personal finance, slightly less for pop culture. So we see again the same partisan divide. People rather want to chat with the in-group than the out-group, and as a consequence, you have to pay them more money to have this conversation. Now, what happens if we correct those beliefs? Well, we see a considerable reduction in the gap in the willingness to accept, or the gap in the minimal payment that the participants demand. For politics, this is roughly a 30% reduction. The same is true also for personal finance and pop culture. So while for the control group, we observe a gap in the amount that they require to talk to the outgroup member, correcting beliefs changes or reduces this gap by about 1/3. Now, here we see the results split by the two experiments, and we see basically the same pattern. We see slightly stronger effects in the trustworthiness experiment than in the intelligence experiment. So people adjust more their minimum payment when it's about when they received information about the opponent's trustworthiness. But the differences are not significant. But it points a little bit to the idea that people care more about how kind the other person is and rather how smart that person is. We also do a causal mediation analysis in the paper, basically asking the question, well, how much of the change in the money required to chat is driven by the change in beliefs? And so what our mediation analysis suggests is that roughly 1/3 of the reduction in the difference in how much money I require can be explained by beliefs. And this is similar to other experiments, so it's not 100%, right? It's similar to other experiments. For example, an experiment about providing information about immigrants and then the support for immigrants, or providing information about animal welfare and then measuring how people vote. Now, like I said, it's not 100%. Maybe we have some measurement issues here, but it could also be that learning how smart or how trustworthy a person is, that might spill over into other cognition. So I might think also differently about other traits, maybe related to intelligence or trustworthiness, or it might also reduce how socially distant I feel about the other person. Now, when we look at the data more closely and not just at the difference, how I think and make decisions about the outgroup versus the in-group, when we look separately, we find that participants basically update their beliefs only about the counter-partisans than the co-partisans. And this is also obvious because they were already correct about the in-group, so naturally they adjust about the outgroup. But what we didn't really expect here is that when you look at the minimum payment that they require, they don't decrease how much they asked to chat with the counter-partisan, but rather they increase the minimum payment that they require to chat with the in. So here we have a kind of like an asymmetry with how people update their beliefs. They update their beliefs about the counter-partisans, but then we see a change in how much money they require to talk with the in-group member. So this, like I said, is not something that we initially expected, but if you think about or consider social identity theory, take it more seriously, then you realize that it's more about how you feel about the in-group than rather the out-group. So people derive utility from thinking more positively about the in-group. And so basically, if I learned that my in-group is actually not that special because they score similarly in terms of trustworthiness and intelligence than the out-group, then I feel like an identity threat. And so as a defensive response, what can I do? Well, I can't really change my beliefs immediately because I was just asked and incentivized. So what we believe what was going on is kind of that they avoided interacting with the in-group to protect their partisan identity. So if I don't have to talk more to my in-group and realize they're actually nothing special, then I can still think more positively about my in-group. Now, perhaps more importantly, why do we observe no effects on effective polarization, but we do observe a convergence when we think about the willingness to chat? And so we can't definitely give an answer here, but we can hypothesize what's going on. So first, maybe these are just two different constructs. Like when we look at the correlation, they are positively correlated. So they suggest there is some connection between these two concepts. But the relationship between effective polarization and behaviors might be more complicated than previously assumed. There is more and more research that comes out showing that sometimes interventions affect effective polarization, but doesn't really change downstream behaviors. And then there are other studies who show that you can change downstream behaviors, but effective polarization remains the same. I actually just came across a study this morning published in Nature that shows that the Twitter algorithm affects how like political attitudes, but doesn't necessarily change effective polarization. A second reason why we might see effects in one domain but not another domain is that we measure the willingness to chat using in an incentivized manner, whereas the feelings thermometer is asking about their attitudes without really having any real financial consequences. And researchers have hypothesized that maybe also the way people respond to these questions is that they just want to express their dissatisfaction, but that it doesn't necessarily determine how they then that they act upon it, right? So to conclude, let me just first summarize what our study shows. So first, we find that partisans hold inaccurate beliefs about counterpartisans, both in terms of how trustworthy they think they are and also how intelligent they are. And when we give information that is accurate about both the in-group and the out-group, then we see substantial belief updating. Initially, they're very accurate about the in-group. They are misaligned when they think about the out-group. If you give them information, they're largely update their beliefs. And the change in those beliefs also lead to a change in behavior. But like I said just before, it's that they increase how much money they demand to talk to the in-group rather than that they lower the threshold for the out-group. So we were successfully able to change behavior by changing their beliefs, but it doesn't necessarily imply that we were able to successfully increase the chance that they would talk to an out-group member. So the contribution of our paper is that we show that belief corrections can change social interaction behavior, which then can reduce maybe effective polarization, how people feel about in-groups and out-groups down the road. But at the same time, we weren't able to change directly people's feelings, suggesting that these relationships are more complicated. So the literature is similarly puzzled about this disconnect. So many studies find effects of interventions on effective polarizations that have these downstream behaviors in the social domain, but often they fail to produce changes in the political domain, such as support for political violence or acceptance of norm violations in the political context. So what our study suggests from a pragmatic or practical perspective is that the intervention basically determines what can be changed. So if your goal is to change how people feel about each other, you might want to choose a different intervention than when you want if you want to target behaviors. Okay, that's it.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much.